I never imagined I'd meet my father for the first time while wearing a white coat. For 30 years he was nothing more than a name, an empty space in my life that everyone avoided talking about. According to my mother, he disappeared the moment I was born. He signed away every legal right, packed up his life, and walked out without ever looking back. No birthdays. No phone calls. No explanations. I grew up asking questions that never had answers. When I was younger, I tried to find him. Once, after weeks of searching, I managed to get a message through. He agreed to meet me for coffee. I sat there for over an hour, staring at the door, convincing myself he'd walk in any second. He never did. That was the moment I stopped trying and started hating. Years passed. I buried myself in school, then medical training, and eventually became a doctor. I built a life that didn't include him. Or so I thought. A few weeks ago, while reviewing my patient schedule, a name jumped off the screen. It was his name. First and last. My heart skipped, but I brushed it off. People share names all the time, right? I was wrong. When I called the patient in, the man who walked through my office door was unmistakable. Older, thinner, grayer, but undeniably him. The same face I'd seen in old photographs at my grandparents' house. The same eyes I'd unknowingly inherited. Froze. Every professional instinct told me to stay composed, to treat him like any other patient. But hearing his voice, my father's voice, for the first time in my life shattered something inside me. Halfway through the appointment, I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, gripping the sink as I broke down. 30 years of unanswered questions came crashing down all at once. I didn't tell him. Couldn't. That night I told my wife, Emily, everything. She listened quietly, her expression shifting between disbelief and concern. When I finished, she said something I wasn't ready to hear. This might be your chance. Chance for closure. Or reconciliation. Or heartbreak. I didn't know which scared me more. The next day at work, my mind refused to cooperate. I walked the hospital halls feeling detached from everything around me. Faces blurred together, but my father's face stayed sharp in my memory. Every patient interaction felt heavier than usual. That morning, my first appointment was a young boy and his dad. They laughed together, teased each other, shared inside jokes. Watching them felt like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I wondered if this was some cruel sign from the universe, or maybe a push toward something I'd avoided my entire life. Then, just minutes later, I overheard a shouting match between a father and his teenage son in the waiting area. The anger in their voices made my stomach tighten. It reminded me how much resentment I still carried, and how easily things could explode if I confronted him. Throughout the day, I noticed everything. A father gently holding his daughter's hand after bad news. An elderly man sitting alone, no family beside him. Each moment pulled me in a different emotional direction. By lunchtime, I barely touched my food. Memories from childhood surfaced uninvited. School events with empty seats, Father's Day projects I pretended didn't matter, the silent ache of wondering why I wasn't enough to stay for. That afternoon, my father's name appeared on my schedule again. My hands trembled. I knew I couldn't keep running forever, but I wasn't sure facing him would heal me, or destroy me. That day, I made a decision that would change everything. But when I finally spoke to him, what he said shocked me more than his disappearance ever did. I spent the rest of that day avoiding my reflection. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself in a glass door or polished hallway wall, all I could see was a child wearing a doctor's coat, someone who looked put together on the outside but felt completely exposed inside. By the time my shift ended, my nerves were shot, and my thoughts were louder than the hospital monitors I'd listened to all day. Emily noticed the moment I walked through the door. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world," she said gently. I sat beside her and admitted the truth I'd been circling all day. Part of me wanted answers, and part of me was terrified of hearing them. She reminded me that I didn't owe him forgiveness, or even a conversation, but I did owe myself honesty. I went to bed that night restless, haunted by a future where I never spoke to him and one where I did. The next morning, fate refused to give me a break. My father's name was back on my schedule, I stared at it longer this time. My chest tightened, but instead of the dread I'd felt before, something else crept in. Curiosity mixed with anger. I told myself I'd keep it professional, that I wouldn't cross any lines. Still, when he walked into my office, the room felt smaller. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. I wondered if he recognized me, not as his doctor but as his son. Halfway through the appointment he asked casually, "How long have you been practicing here?" That was it. Something in me snapped, not violently but quietly, like a thread finally giving way. "I think you know," I said. He frowned, confused. I took a breath so deep my lungs burned. "I'm your son." The silence that followed was unbearable. I expected denial, or anger, or panic. Instead, his face softened in a way I hadn't seen before. He leaned back in the chair, eyes glossy, as if he'd been holding something in for years. "I wondered when you'd say it," he replied. That stunned me more than anything else. He told me he'd suspected the moment he saw my name on his paperwork. The resemblance confirmed it. When I demanded to know why he hadn't said anything, he admitted he didn't feel he had the right. He said he believed that if I wanted answers, I'd come to him when I was ready. That explanation lit a fire in my chest. I asked him why he left, why he disappeared, why he made me grow up wondering what was wrong with me. His answers were vague. Fear, bad decisions, being young and overwhelmed. Each word felt like another excuse stacked on top of years of silence. I lost control. I told him he didn't get to call himself scared when he abandoned a child. That a real father doesn't vanish and then wait decades for forgiveness. I told him he chose himself over me, and that choice followed me my entire life. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He just listened, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the floor. When I finished, the room felt heavy with everything unsaid. Finally he whispered, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough, but it wasn't nothing." He told me he wanted to know me now. That he understood if I didn't want the same. He said there was no pressure, no expectations, and that the decision was mine alone. Then he stood, thanked me for my professionalism, and left. I sat there long after he was gone. The following days blurred together. I threw myself into work, hoping exhaustion would quiet my thoughts. Didn't. Emily noticed the distance in my eyes and encouraged me to talk, reminding me that conflicting emotions didn't cancel each other out. A few weeks later, his name appeared on my schedule again. This time my heart didn't race, it waited. After the appointment, I did something I never thought I would. I handed him a small piece of paper with my personal number written on it. "If you still want to talk," I said, "call me." He stared at the note, then back at me, a cautious smile breaking through. As he walked away, doubt flooded in. Had I just opened an old wound? Or finally started healing one? I thought giving him my number was the hardest part. But when my phone rang days later and I saw his name on the screen, I realized the real test was just beginning. When my phone finally rang, I almost didn't answer it. His name sat on the screen like a weight pressing against my chest. I stared at it until the vibration stopped, then started again. My thumb hovered over the screen as a dozen worst-case scenarios ran through my head. What if this was a mistake? What if talking reopened wounds I'd spent decades trying to close? I answered anyway. His voice was quieter than I remembered from the clinic. He asked how I was doing, as if we'd spoken just yesterday instead of being separated by 30 years. After a pause, he asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. "Nothing heavy," he said. "Just a conversation." I hesitated, then agreed. The next afternoon I arrived early. Old habits die hard. I chose a table near the window, ordered a coffee I barely touched, and waited. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him outside a hospital setting. Without the clinical lights and paperwork between us, he looked smaller, more human. The first few minutes were painfully awkward. We talked about the weather, the cafe, the city. Safe topics. Neutral ground. But eventually, silence forced honesty into the space. He began to talk. He didn't start with apologies or excuses. He told me about his life after leaving, how he bounced between jobs, how loneliness followed him like a shadow, how every birthday he did the math and wondered what kind of person I was becoming. He admitted he never felt proud of himself enough to come looking for me. Listening to him felt strange. This wasn't the monster I'd imagined growing up. He was flawed, uncomfortable, and visibly afraid of saying the wrong thing. That didn't erase the past, but it complicated it. We met again the following week. Then again after that. Each conversation peeled back another layer. He talked about addiction, how it crept in quietly and took control before he realized it. He talked about fear, of failing, of hurting my mother, of becoming the kind of man a child deserved. He said leaving felt like the only option at the time, even though it haunted him every day afterward. Hearing this hurt, but it also filled in gaps I'd carried my whole life. One afternoon, he finally gave me the answer I'd waited decades for. He admitted that when I was born, his life was already spiraling. He was borrowing money from dangerous people, making choices he couldn't undo, and sinking deeper into addiction. He believed disappearing was the only way to keep that chaos away from my mother and me. "I know it doesn't make it right," he said. "It just makes it the truth." I didn't forgive him in that moment. But something shifted. For the first time, his absence felt less like rejection and more like fear. Not noble fear. Not justified fear. Just human fear. And somehow that made it easier to breathe. Weeks turned into months. Our conversations grew more natural. We talked about my career, my marriage, the life I'd built without him. He listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and never tried to insert himself where he didn't belong. One evening, we sat on a park bench as the sun dipped below the horizon. He looked at me and said something I didn't realize I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. "I'm proud of you." My throat tightened. I nodded, unable to speak, embarrassed by the tears I couldn't stop. I'd achieved so much, but that single sentence hit harder than any award or recognition ever had. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. Came slowly, in fragments. In understanding. In boundaries. In allowing myself to let go of anger that no longer served me. Just as things began to feel stable, life reminded me how fragile everything was. His health started to decline. Doctor visits turned serious. Conversations grew heavier. One night, I found myself standing beside his hospital bed, watching machines track the rhythm of a life I'd only just begun to know. Fear gripped me, not of losing him again, but of losing him for good. Emily stood beside me, steady as always. She reminded me that healing doesn't require perfection, just presence. Thought we had time. I was wrong. Just when I believed we were finally building something real. His health took a turn that forced me to confront a terrifying question. Was I about to lose my father all over again? The hospital room felt eerily familiar, except this time I wasn't the doctor in control. Monitors hummed softly beside my father's bed, their steady rhythm doing little to calm my thoughts. I'd spent years caring for strangers in rooms just like this, offering reassurance and explaining procedures. Now, standing on the other side, I felt powerless. His condition had worsened quickly. What began as routine checkups turned into urgent tests and late-night calls. I knew the language, understood the charts, but none of that made it easier. If anything, it made the fear sharper. One night, after the nurses stepped out, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't place. Regret. Gratitude. Maybe both. "I'm glad you gave me a chance," he said quietly. I swallowed hard. Me too. Those words surprised us both. I started visiting daily, even when my schedule was packed. We talked about small things, movies, books, memories he wished he'd shared sooner. Other times we sat in silence, letting the moment speak for itself. I realized that rebuilding a relationship didn't require grand gestures, just showing up. Emily came often, her calm presence grounding me when my emotions threatened to spiral. She reminded me that no matter what happened, Choosing connection over resentment had already changed me. A few days later, my father asked if we could talk privately. There was something in his voice that made my stomach drop. He told me there was more to his disappearance than addiction and fear. Years ago, he'd gotten involved with people who weren't just bad influences. They were dangerous. His debts weren't financial alone, and walking away wasn't only about running from responsibility. I thought leaving was the only way to keep you and your mother safe, he admitted. I didn't trust myself, or them. The revelation hit me like a punch. Part of me wanted to scream that he should have trusted my mother with the truth, that disappearing caused its own kind of damage. Another part understood how fear warps logic, how desperation convinces you that silence is protection. I didn't excuse him, but I understood him more than ever. As days passed, his condition stabilized, then wavered, then stabilized again. Each time a doctor entered the room, my heart jumped. I began to realize how quickly life could change, and how little control we actually have. During one quiet evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, he reached for my hand. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "But knowing you, that's been enough." I squeezed his hand, emotions tangled and overwhelming. I didn't know if forgiveness had fully arrived, but I knew I didn't want regret to be the final chapter of our story. Slowly, he began to recover. Discharge day felt surreal. We walked out together, lighter but forever changed. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became honest.
Over the following months, he integrated into my world carefully, respectfully. He attended a medical conference I spoke at, sitting quietly in the back, pride written all over his face. We shared holidays, awkward at first, then warm. Each moment felt borrowed, precious. One evening, while sitting in my living room, he grew serious again. "There's something else you should know," he said. My chest tightened. He explained that when he left, he cut ties completely, not just with us, but with everyone. He spent years trying to become someone worthy of being found. Therapy, sobriety, stability, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he needed to live with himself. Hearing that didn't erase the pain of my childhood, but it reframed it. His absence wasn't indifference. It was brokenness. As the night ended, I realized something profound. Healing doesn't mean the past stops hurting. It means the pain no longer controls you. I thought we'd finally reached steady ground. Life, once again, had other plans. Just when peace felt possible, an unexpected truth emerged. One that would force me to question everything I thought I understood about my father's sacrifice and my own capacity to forgive. Peace, I learned, is never loud. It arrived quietly, in shared meals, in short phone calls, in moments where I catch myself smiling at something my father said and only realize later how natural it felt. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying anger everywhere I went. I wasn't healed exactly, but I was lighter. Then reality reminded me that reconciliation doesn't erase consequences. My father's health continued to hover in an uncomfortable gray area. Good days were followed by bad ones, and I found myself constantly bracing for the next phone call. As a doctor, I understood the probabilities. As a son, I refused to accept them. One night, I stayed late at the hospital after my shift ended. He was asleep, the room dim except for the soft glow of machines. Watching him breathe, I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear of loss layered on top of decades of absence. It was unfair, I thought, that I finally had him only to risk losing him so soon. Emily sat beside me, her hand resting on my arm. "Whatever happened," she whispered, "you chose love. That matters." Her words stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, my father grew more reflective. He spoke openly about regret, not just about leaving, but about the years he wasted believing he wasn't capable of change. He admitted that reconnecting with me forced him to confront who he'd been and who he wanted to be remembered as. One evening, after a long pause, he asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. "Do you ever wish I'd stayed, even if things were messy?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated. Staying might have meant chaos, instability, and fear. Leaving meant absence, confusion, and pain. Neither option spared me. I told him that what hurt most wasn't his mistakes. It was the silence that followed them. He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. That conversation changed something between us. From then on, there were no half-truths, no avoiding difficult topics. We spoke honestly, even when it hurt. As his strength returned, we began doing ordinary things together. Grocery runs, short walks, quiet dinners. Nothing extraordinary. Everything meaningful. I realized that healing wasn't found in dramatic apologies or grand gestures, but in consistency. Months passed. His health improved enough that the constant fear receded into the background. He started making plans again. Small ones, careful ones. He talked about the future in a way he never had before. And for the first time, I let myself believe there might actually be one. One afternoon, while sitting on my porch, he shared something he'd never said out loud. "When I left," he said, staring at the ground, "I thought disappearing would make your life easier. I see now that it only made mine emptier and yours harder." There was no defense in his voice, just acceptance. I told him that forgiving him didn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It meant choosing not to let it define our present. He smiled then, not the hesitant smile from our first meetings, but something genuine. As time went on, people around me began to notice the change. I was more patient, more present. Even my work felt different. Treating families in crisis no longer felt distant. I understood them in a way I never had before. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, he stopped and looked at me. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me try." That night, after he left, I sat quietly and reflected on how far we'd come. I thought about the boy I once was, angry, confused, convinced he'd never get answers. I wished I could tell him that understanding would come, even if it took decades. I believed the hardest part was behind us. I was wrong. Just when I felt confident we'd found our rhythm, an unexpected turn forced me to confront a truth that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness, family, and letting go. The call came on an ordinary evening. No urgency in the ringtone. No warning. Just my phone lighting up while Emily and I were clearing the dinner table. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt, and how fragile peace can be. The hospital number on the screen made my stomach drop. By the time I arrived, the familiar corridors felt colder than usual. His condition had deteriorated rapidly. Complications piled up in a way even I couldn't explain away with logic or optimism. This time, there was no pretending we had endless chances. I sat beside his bed long into the night, listening to the slow rhythm of machines doing work his body struggled to manage. For the first time since reconnecting, I allowed myself to mourn not just the possibility of losing him, but the years we never had. He woke briefly just before dawn. When he saw me, he smiled weakly. "You came," he said. "Of course I did." He reached for my hand with surprising strength. "I need you to know something," he whispered. "Finding you again, it saved me, no matter what happens now." Tears blurred my vision. I told him that knowing him had changed me too, that the anger I carried for so long no longer owned me, that even though our time was short, it mattered. He nodded, eyes closing slowly. That's all I ever wanted. In the following days, his condition stabilized just enough for us to talk in fragments. He told me he'd made peace with his past, that he wasn't afraid anymore. Watching him accept what might come was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. One afternoon, when the room was quiet and the sunlight stretched across the floor, he asked me to promise something. "Live fully," he said. "Don't carry what isn't yours anymore." I promised. Eventually, the moment came that I'd been bracing for. He passed peacefully, without pain. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a gentle stillness that filled the room. I stayed long after the nurses left, holding his hand, feeling both loss and gratitude tangled together. The grief surprised me. It wasn't sharp like the pain of abandonment. It was deep, steady, and heavy with love. I mourned not only the man I'd lost, but the father I'd just begun to know. Emily stood by me through everything. She reminded me that love doesn't require a lifetime to be real. Sometimes it just needs honesty and courage. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on how much had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't searching for answers. I had them. They weren't perfect, but they were real. I realized forgiveness hadn't been a gift to him. It had been a gift to myself. Now, when I see fathers and sons in the hospital, I don't feel bitterness. I feel understanding. I know that people are complicated, broken, and capable of growth, even late in life. My father didn't get the chance to raise me, but he did get the chance to know me, and I got the chance to let go. Sometimes, closure doesn't come from rewriting the past. It comes from choosing how the story ends. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that holding on to anger only delays healing. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is open the door one last time